There is a particular kind of morning that belongs only to Colorado in September. The sky comes up slow and cold and impossibly clear. The kind of clear that makes you feel like you could see all the way to the edge of the world if you just stood still long enough. The Rocky Mountains to the west catch the first light before anything else does. And for a few minutes, just a few, they turn a color that has no proper name. Not gold, not orange. Something between the two that exists only in that moment and then is gone. Elliot Marin had watched that light come up over those mountains for 31 years. He was watching it now. He sat on the front porch of the ranch house with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, the way he sat every morning in the same chair, at the same hour with the same view. A man of habit. A man who had learned through considerable trial and the kind of error that leaves marks that routine was the closest thing to peace that a person could manufacture on their own. He was 55 years old. His hair had gone the color of winter grass, that particular gray that is not quite silver and not quite white, but somewhere honest between the two. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked land for 3 decades, wide across the knuckles, marked with small scars from fences and tools and the general negotiations of a life lived outdoors. The kind of hands that looked like they belonged to the earth they worked. He drank his coffee and watched the mountains and did not think about Tuesday. That was what he told himself. He was not thinking about Tuesday. Across the field to the south, separated from the Marin property by a low fence line, and 40 yards of morning grass still silver with dew, the Bennett land sat quiet in the early light. The farmhouse there was smaller than his. Neat. The kind of neat that takes daily effort and not just occasional attention. The garden along the south wall had been put to bed for the season with the particular care of someone who intended to return to it in spring. He was not looking at the Bennett property. He was looking at the mountains. The mountains happened to be in that general direction. Tuesday was 4 days away. Elliot Marin set down his coffee cup and stood up from the chair with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees have opinions about cold mornings. He had work to do. He always had work to do. The ranch did not pause for a man's interior weather, and he had learned long ago that this was not a flaw in the arrangement, but a feature of it. Work was the one thing that asked nothing of him except his hands and his attention. Work did not require him to be anything other than useful. He went to find Gerald. Gerald was a 17-year-old bay quarter horse who had outlived 2 of Elliot's cattle dogs one particularly harsh winter, and what the veterinarian from Durango had described as a respiratory situation that should have resolved itself differently. Gerald was by any practical measure elderly. He moved with the considered pace of someone who has decided that urgency is a young man's luxury. He ate deliberately. He regarded the world with the equanimity of a creature that has arrived at some private understanding about the nature of things. Elliot found him in the paddock standing at the east rail watching the morning arrive. "North fence today," Elliot said. Gerald turned his head and looked at him. "I know," Elliot said, "but it needs doing." He saddled the horse with the practiced efficiency of a man who has performed this task so many times that his hands know the sequence without instruction from his mind. Cinch. Stirrup. The particular adjustment to the left side that Gerald's back required now that age had redistributed his top line. He did these things and tried not to notice that Tuesday was 4 days away. He had gotten better at not noticing things. He had been getting better at it for 3 years. Adeline Marin had died in the spring of 1880. Not quickly. The illness had taken its time the way illnesses do when they are thorough, and Elliot had sat with her through all of it, through the good days when she seemed almost herself, and the bad days when she was somewhere he couldn't follow, and the final days when the distance between them grew until it became the permanent kind. He had buried her under the old cottonwood east of the house on a Thursday morning in April, and he had gone back to work the following Friday because work was the only language he knew that could hold the weight of what had happened without collapsing under it. People said different things about that. Some said it admiringly. A man of constitution, they said. A man who knows how to carry his grief without making it everyone else's burden. Others said it with a kind of quiet concern, the way people look at a house with all the windows shut on a summer day. Elliot had no opinion about what people said. He simply did not know what else to do. What he knew was this: the house was too large for one person. He had not understood that when it was 2 of them. You don't understand the size of a space until you are the only one moving through it. The kitchen in the morning, the table set for one, the sound of his own boots on the floor, which he had never noticed before, and now could not stop hearing. The room where Adeline had slept through those final months, he kept closed. The curtain she had hung in the east kitchen window, a pale blue cotton curtain she had ordered from a catalog the previous winter arriving just 6 weeks before she died, he left in place. It had faded now. 3 years of Colorado sun had taken most of the color out of it. It was the color of something that had been blue once and remembered it. He left it hanging. He could not have explained why. He was not a man much given to explaining the things he could not explain. Nora Callum had lived on the neighboring property her entire life. She was 25 years old and she had grown up watching the Marin Ranch the way you grow up watching a landmark, something so constant and present that it becomes part of the landscape of your interior life without you ever making the decision to let it in. She knew the creak of the gate on the north end. She knew the way the old barn leaned slightly east from a winter storm 12 years back that had pressed it in that direction and never fully let go. She knew that Elliot Marin checked the north fence line on Monday afternoons and the south fence on Thursdays, and that he talked to his horse with more regularity and apparent satisfaction than he talked to most people. She had been bringing him food since 2 weeks after Adeline's funeral. Every Tuesday. Not every day she was running 40 acres alone, which required the full application of her attention every hour of daylight and some hours that weren't. But Tuesdays, a pot of something or bread or pie when the season was right. She carried it across the field between their properties and went up the porch steps, and he accepted it with the same 2 words, "You didn't have to." And she replied with the same 2 words, "I know." And they stood on the porch and talked for a while about the practical things of the season, and then she went back across the field. This had happened by her count approximately 146 times. What no one in Durango knew, what Elliot Marin himself did not know, was why she had started. It was not pity. She wanted to be clear about that, at least with herself, at least in the privacy of her own accounting. It was not the generalized charity that a community extends to its grieving members, though she had that too in its proper proportion. It was something more specific than that, something that had a shape she could identify but had not yet found the words for. The actual reason, the reason she carried with her like a stone in a coat pocket smooth from handling, had its origin 3 weeks before Adeline died. Adeline had asked Nora to come to the house. She was having a better day, one of those days that arrive late in an illness, like a gift you are almost afraid to accept because you have learned what they mean. She was sitting up in the armchair by the window. The faded blue curtain was new, then still the color it was supposed to be. She had taken Nora's hand, and she had said, "Don't let him go through the first winter alone. Not look in on him occasionally. Not bring a casserole when you think of it." She said, "Don't let him go through the first winter alone." Said it the way you say something you have thought about with great care. Said it looking directly at Nora with eyes that were tired and very clear. Nora had said, "I won't," and she had kept that promise for 3 years. And Elliot Marin had accepted every Tuesday for 3 years without ever knowing that his wife had arranged them. There was something about that fact that Nora had never been able to put entirely to rest. Not guilt, she had done nothing wrong. Not grief, she had known and loved Adeline in her way. Something more complicated than either. The sense of being trusted with something fragile by someone who could no longer follow up on the trust. The weight of a promise made to the dying, which is a different weight entirely from a promise made to the living. She carried it across the field every Tuesday and set it down on the porch railing and picked it back up when she left. On a Monday evening, in the second week of September 1883, Nora Callum made an apple pie. The apples came from the tree at the south end of her property, the old tree her father had planted the year she was born, the one that came in sweet in September and not a moment before. She made the crust the way her mother had taught her, cold butter and cold hands, and don't overwork it, and she crimped the edges with a care that, if she was being honest with herself in the particular way she tried to be when no one else was watching, was somewhat in excess of what the occasion required. She was being more careful than she needed to be. She noticed this. She noted it in the same internal ledger where she kept other things she noticed about herself and didn't examine too closely. She put the pie on the windowsill to cool and stood in her kitchen in the Monday evening light and looked out across the field toward the Marin Ranch. The light was the September kind, long and golden and unhurried. The ranch sat in it the way it always sat, solid and weathered and entirely itself. She could see the east window of the kitchen from here. The curtain in it was a pale color she knew had once been blue. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned back to her kitchen and did the evening dishes and went to bed. The Tuesday morning came up the way Tuesday mornings did. She carried the pie across the field under a sky doing what Colorado skies do in September, that improbable deep blue, the kind that makes everything beneath it look like a painting of itself rather than the thing itself. The dew was still on the grass and her boots were wet by the time she reached the fence gate. Elliot was on the porch. He usually was on Tuesday mornings. She had never remarked on this directly, and he had never offered an explanation for it. And this was one of the many things between them that existed in the category of things that both parties understood and neither party named. He was drinking coffee and watching the mountains with the stillness that was his natural condition, the stillness of a man who has made some private accommodation with silence and found it adequate company. She came up the porch steps and held out the pie. He looked at it the way he looked at things that mattered to him directly, with his full attention, taking it seriously. "Apple," he said. "September apples," she said. "The good ones." He looked at the pie, then at her. And then the rare thing happened. The thing that had always caught her off guard because it arrived without warning and stayed only briefly. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that changed his whole face, that arrived slowly and rearranged everything, that made him look like a version of himself that had existed before the hard years had done their work. The smile of the man he had been before glimpsed through the man he was now. "If only I were 10 years younger," he said. He said it the way you say something that is meant to land gently and move along. A joke, a deflection dressed up as warmth. Nora looked at him. The Colorado morning held them both. A hawk turned somewhere overhead. The mountains did what they always did. 10 years wouldn't be enough," she said. And then, before the words could settle into the air between them and become something that required a response, she set the pie on the porch railing and told him she had cattle to check and went back across the field. Elliot stood on the porch and looked at the pie. He stood there for quite a long time. He told Gerald about it that afternoon. This was not unusual. Gerald had been the recipient of Elliot's confidences for most of the horse's life, and the arrangement had worked reasonably well because Gerald was a good listener and had no opinion about anything that could create further complications. Elliot was at the north fence doing the work he'd said he'd do, and Gerald was standing nearby in the companionable way that horses sometimes stand nearby when they have decided your company is acceptable. "She said 10 years wouldn't be enough," Elliot said. He pulled a fence staple and examined it and put it in the bag. "I said the thing I said because it was the kind of thing you say, the kind of thing that means something and nothing at the same time, and everyone is allowed to go home and pretend it was nothing." He pulled another staple. "She didn't let it be nothing." Gerald shifted his weight. 10 years wouldn't be enough," Elliot said again. He turned it over. He was a man who turned things over carefully, the way you turn soil, completely attending to what's underneath before deciding what to do with it. 10 years younger would make him 45. 45 and 25. Still a gap that people would notice. Still a gap that Durango would have opinions about, and Durango always had opinions about everything, especially the kinds of things people did that didn't fit the expected shape of their lives. But that wasn't what she'd said. She hadn't said 10 years would be enough. She'd said 10 years wouldn't be. He stood at the fence and looked at the mountains and turned that over too. And then he did the thing that arrived without his permission, the thing that rose up from somewhere below the part of him that made decisions he began to remember. Not the way you deliberately remember calling up an image with intention, the way memory sometimes moves on its own, surfacing things you didn't know you had stored. He remembered the first Tuesday she had come, 2 weeks after the funeral. He had been at the kitchen table doing nothing in particular. The particular nothing of early grief, and there had been a knock at the door, and there she was on the porch, with a pot of something that smelled like the world, continuing on without his permission. He remembered the way she held the pot with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because it was hot. The slight redness of her palms when she passed it over. He remembered a Tuesday the following February when a late storm had come through and the field between the properties had been knee-deep in snow, and she had still come moving through it methodically, not asking for acknowledgement of the effort. He remembered the Tuesday she had come with a cut on her hand, a fence wire she'd said dismissively already wrapped in a bandage she had clearly tied herself, and he had noticed the bandage was slightly crooked and had almost said something and had not. He remembered the sound of her voice on the porch saying, "I know always, I know," in response to his, "You didn't have to," the way she said it, with the particular inflection of someone who is not looking for gratitude and is not going to encourage you to offer it. He had been remembering these things. He had been remembering them with a detail and a specificity That was not the detail of casual recollection. He had been remembering them with the attention of someone who had been paying very close attention, without until this moment acknowledging to himself that he had been paying very close attention. Elliot Marin stood at the north fence of the Marin Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1883 and understood with the slow and reluctant clarity of a man who processes things thoroughly rather than quickly that he had been cataloging Nora Callum for 3 years. The way she walked across the field, purposeful, unhurried. The way she talked about her cattle at the market in Durango and what she said about getting fair prices. The way she laughed at things he said that he hadn't been certain were funny. The way she stood on his porch and looked at the mountains with the expression of someone who finds them genuinely interesting rather than simply there. He had stored all of it in a category he had labeled without examining the label good neighbor. It was a solid category. It required nothing of him. It was safe in the way that locked rooms are safe not because there is nothing in them, but because the door stays closed. He pulled the last staple that needed pulling and put away his tools and rode Gerald back to the barn in the long afternoon light. He was not a man who reached conclusions quickly. He was going to need time with this. He had time. What he was not sure about riding back across his own land in the September light was how much of it he was willing to spend. 2 days later, on a Thursday, Cornelia Voss told him. He had gone into Durango for supplies, salt staples, a length of rope for the east paddock gate, and he had stopped at Voss's dry goods the way he always stopped, because Cornelia ran an efficient operation, and because her prices were fair, and because she did not, as a general rule, tell him things he did not ask about. On this particular Thursday, she departed from that general rule. She found him at the back of the store, examining the quality of the rope, and she said without preliminary that Declan Hurst had been to see Nora Callum and had brought her flowers from Denver. Elliot examined the rope. Ordered them special, Cornelia said. From that florist on the rail line. Arranged flowers, not wildflowers. She paused as if this distinction required a moment to settle. He's been to the market on the days she's there, 3 times this month, and now the flowers from Denver. Elliot paid for the rope. He's 28, Cornelia said. His father has the largest supply contract in the county. Good family, solid prospects. She looked at him with the direct look she had for things she considered important. I say this to you because you've been a neighbor to that girl for years. You might have a thought about it. Elliot put the rope under his arm. Thank you, Cornelia, he said. He rode home. He put Gerald away and fed the other horses and checked the water in the south trough and stood for a while in the barn in the particular quiet of a barn at evening, which is different from all other kinds of quiet because it is occupied, alive with the breathing and shifting of animals. The quality of a silence that contains things rather than the quality of a silence that is simply empty. He went into the house. He sat at the kitchen table. Declan Hurst was 28 years old. He was the son of the most prosperous merchant in Durango, and he was known by all accounts that Elliot had collected without intending to collect them as a man of reasonable character. Not a fool, not cruel. The town approved of him because the town understood the logic of him, young, prosperous, the kind of man who would make a sensible match for a capable young woman running a property alone. Elliot was 55. He was aware of what that number meant in this particular calculation. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window across the room. The curtain hung there the way it always hung. Pale now, the color of something that had once been blue and remembered it distantly the way you remember a language you learned as a child and haven't spoken in years. Adeline had hung it there in the February of the year she died 6 weeks before she was gone, and he had never taken it down. It was just a curtain. He knew it was just a curtain, and yet it had hung there for 3 years untouched while he had repaired the barn roof and replaced the boards on the north fence and fixed the east gate and done 100 other things to the property that needed doing. He had worked the entire ranch, maintained everything that needed maintaining. Everything except this one window, this one pale curtain that had once been blue. He looked at it for a long time. Then he got up and made himself supper and did not look at it again that evening. But he had looked at it. For the first time in 3 years, he had really looked at it. And something about that, the simple act of looking at a thing he had been not looking at for 3 years, felt like the first movement of something that had been entirely still. He went to bed. He lay in the dark in the ranch house that was too large for one person and listened to the Colorado night outside the window, the wind coming down off the mountains, the particular sound of September moving toward October, And he thought about 10 years wouldn't be enough. And what a person means when they say a thing like that, and whether the man who could receive a thing like that deserved to. He did not arrive at an answer, but he kept the question. He had a feeling, though he was not ready to examine it directly, that the question was not going anywhere, that it had in fact been waiting. 14 days. That was how long Elliot Marin turned it over before he arrived at anything resembling a conclusion. And even then what he arrived at was less a conclusion than a direction. A bearing the way you take a bearing in open country, not a destination, just the angle you point yourself toward, and begin walking. 14 days of north fence and south fence, and the winter pasture and the barn roof on the west side that had been on his list since August. 14 days of work that his hands knew how to do without requiring much from the part of him that was otherwise occupied. This was the value of physical labor that Elliot had understood since he was 19 years old and working his father's land. It does not ask for your full attention. It asks for your hands and your back and a portion of your mind, and it allows the rest of you to go somewhere else and work on whatever needs working on. What needed working on was considerable. Gerald bore the brunt of it. Gerald had over the years developed what Elliot privately considered a sophisticated understanding of when he was expected to listen versus when he was expected to respond, and he had long since arrived at the pragmatic position that listening was almost always sufficient. He stood in the paddock or the barn or at various points along the fence lines where Elliot paused in his work, and he listened with his ears in the forward position and his eyes on Elliot with the steady attention of a creature that has decided your concerns are worth his time, even if he has nothing useful to add. The problem, Elliot said on the third day working the hinge on the south gate, is not what I feel. Gerald waited. The problem is what I have to offer. Elliot worked the hinge free and examined the rust on it. A man who is 55 years old has to be honest about what he is bringing to that particular conversation. He set the old hinge aside and reached for the new one. 25 years, he said. That's the distance. That's 30 years from now. I'll be 85 and she'll be 55. If she's lucky, she'll have 30 more years after that. Good years, healthy years. Years that don't have me in them. He worked the new hinge into position. That's not nothing. That's a real thing that a person should think about before they open their mouth and say something they can't take back. Gerald shifted his weight. I'm not saying it's impossible, Elliot said. I'm saying a man ought to be honest. He was being honest. That was the thing about these conversations with Gerald. They had the quality of genuine honesty, the kind you can only manage when there is no audience and no consequence, and the other party cannot repeat anything you say. Elliot had learned over 3 years of Tuesday mornings and silent evenings that this was where you found the truth of a thing alone out loud, in the presence of something that would not judge you for it. The truth as he found it in those 14 days was more complicated than the arithmetic. The arithmetic said 55 and 25. 30 years of difference, a real gap with real implications, and anyone who said otherwise was not paying attention to the numbers. But there was another set of numbers. 3 years, 146 Tuesdays. 146 times she had crossed that field and come up those porch steps and stood there and talked to him about the real things, the cattle prices and the fence conditions and the quality of the September apples, and once on a Tuesday in January 2 years back, about the nature of loneliness and how it was different from solitude and how a person had to be careful not to confuse the two. He had thought about that conversation for weeks afterward. He had filed it under good neighbor and moved on. He was less able to do that now. On the 6th day, Declan Hurst came to the barn. Elliot was mucking the center aisle, the work that is never finished and never glamorous and always necessary. He heard the footsteps before he saw the man, the particular sound of dress boots on packed earth. Not work boots. He looked up and there was Declan Hurst standing at the barn entrance with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now committed to delivering it. Declan Hurst was 28 years old and looked it. Dark-haired, well-built, with the particular kind of confidence that grows in men who have always been found acceptable by the world. Not arrogant, Elliot had considered this carefully and arrived at the honest assessment that Declan Hurst was not arrogant. He was certain. There was a difference. Arrogance mistakes itself for more than it is. Certainty simply knows what it is and stands in it. Mr. Marin, Declan said. Hurst, Elliot said. He kept working. This was not rudeness. This was the economy of a man who had long since stopped performing attention. He was not giving, and he was giving Declan Hurst his full attention while his hands continued their work because the hands did not need supervision for this particular task. "I'll say what I came to say and let you get back to it," Declan said. "All right, I have serious intentions toward Nora Callum." He said it the way you say something you have decided to say clearly rather than cleverly. "I expect you know that. Most of Durango knows it by now." He paused. "What most of Durango doesn't know is that every time I sit at her kitchen table, she looks out the window toward this ranch." Elliot stopped working. He stood in the center aisle of his barn with the pitchfork in his hands and looked at Declan Hurst. "I'm not saying that to make trouble," Declan said. "I'm not a man who makes trouble. I'm saying it because I think you should know the situation clearly, and I think you're a man who would want to." He turned his hat in his hands once. "I'm 28 years old. I can offer her things a man your age cannot." That's not a criticism. That's the plain arithmetic. The barn was very quiet. A horse shifted in one of the stalls. Gerald from the paddock made no sound at all. "Does she know you're here?" Elliot said. Something moved across Declan's face. Not embarrassment. The honest recognition of a man who has been asked a fair question and owes a fair answer. "No," he said. Elliot looked at him for a moment. "Then you have your answer," he said. Declan nodded. He put his hat back on. He was halfway to the door when he stopped and stood there for a moment with his back to Elliot and said quietly to the barn entrance, "You know better than most men that time doesn't hold still. That's all I came to say." Then he walked out. Elliot stood in the center aisle of his barn for a long time after the sound of those dress boots faded. He was not angry. He had examined that question immediately and carefully and arrived at the honest answer. He was not angry. Declan Hurst had not come to threaten him or demean him. He had come to tell the truth as he understood it, and the truth as Declan Hurst understood it was not wrong. The arithmetic was real. Time was real. 28 was 28 and 55 was 55, and no amount of September morning light on the Rocky Mountains changed those numbers. What Declan had not known, could not have known, was the specific way the words landed. "You know better than most men that time doesn't hold still." Yes, he did know that. He had learned it on a Thursday morning in April of 1880, standing under the cottonwood east of the house, and he had carried the knowledge of it in his chest every day since. Time does not hold still. The people you intend to tell things to do not wait indefinitely for you to find the right moment. The right moment is not a thing that the calendar manufactures for you. It is a thing you make or you don't, and if you don't, the calendar moves forward without your participation. He set the pitchfork against the wall. He sat down on a hay bale. Gerald appeared at the paddock window, the small window at the south end of the barn that opened to the outside, the one Gerald had figured out years ago, allowed him to participate in barn conversations from the convenience of the paddock, and looked in at him. "I know," Elliot said. Gerald held his gaze. "I know," Elliot said again differently. The harvest social was on the last Saturday of October. Elliot did not go. He had not been to a social since Adeline, and he was not ready for that, for the noise of it, the togetherness of it, the particular quality of a community gathered to celebrate the season, which was a quality he had always liked before, and now found in his current state more than he was equipped to manage. He knew his limits. Knowing your limits was not weakness. It was the practical intelligence of a man who has learned what he can carry and what will drop him. He stayed at the ranch. He ate supper alone at the kitchen table and read a little from the almanac and went to bed at the hour. He always went to bed, and if he thought about what was happening across town in the Durango meeting hall, the music and the warmth, and a specific young woman in whatever she wore to an autumn social, he thought about it only briefly and then put it away. He was good at putting things away. He had been practicing for 3 years. What he could not put away was what came the next morning, which was a Sunday, when he rode into Durango for the service at Reverend Crane's church and found himself standing outside afterward with Hector Blaine from the feed store, who told him without being asked that Nora Callum had come to the social without Declan Hurst and left early, and that Declan had spent the latter part of the evening in conversation with a young woman from the Linden family, which people were finding interesting. Elliot rode home through the Sunday morning thinking about a woman who had gone to a social alone and left early. He thought about where she had gone when she left. He thought about what she had done with the rest of that evening. He thought about the field between the two properties, dark and silver under the October moon, and whether she had stood at her window looking across it the way he had found himself standing at his window looking across it on more evenings than he was prepared to count. He unsaddled Gerald and put him in the paddock and stood in the barn for a while in the way he stood in the barn when the barn was serving its secondary purpose, which was the purpose of being a place where a man could stand and think without the thinking being visible to anyone. Then he went into the house, and he did the thing he had not done in 3 years. He opened the door to Adeline's room. The room had been closed since the spring of 1880. Not locked. Elliot was not a man who locked rooms against himself in the dramatic sense. He simply had not opened the door. He had put his hand on the handle on several occasions over 3 years in the early weeks in the first winter on the anniversary of her death, and each time he had stood there for a moment and then removed his hand and walked away. There had not been a right time. There was not a right time now either. There was only the time that existed, which was a Sunday evening in October of 1883, with the harvest behind him and the winter coming, and something in his chest that had been shifting and rearranging itself for 6 weeks and needed finally a place to land. He turned the handle and opened the door. The room smelled of time, that particular quality of a closed space, not unpleasant, not the smell of decay, but the smell of air that has been still long enough to become a kind of record of everything it once contained. Dust in the slant of evening light coming through the window. The quilt on the bed that Adeline had made the winter before her illness, blue and white, and precisely geometric the way she made everything. Precise. Considered. Her presence in objects even after her absence from the world. He stood in the doorway for a while, then he went in. He sat in the chair by the window, the armchair where she had spent her last good weeks, where she had done her reading and her letter writing, and whatever private thinking she did in the time she knew was limited. He sat in it and looked at the room. On the small table beside the chair was a book and a pair of reading glasses and a journal, her handwriting on the cover. He picked it up. He had not read it. In 3 years he had not read it because it was hers, because whatever was in it was between her and herself, and he had felt clearly that reading it would be a kind of intrusion, the way going through a person's pockets is an intrusion even when the person is gone. He held it in his hands. He turned it over. He opened it to the last page that had writing on it. Her handwriting was small and clear, the handwriting of a woman who had been schooled carefully and had maintained the habit. He read the date first. February 14th, 1880, 7 weeks before she died. In the last weeks, her hands had not been steady enough for writing, and she had stopped, and so this was the last thing she had set down. He read it twice. She had written about Nora Callum. She had written in the direct, unsentimental way Adeline had always written about everything the way she thought without decoration, that she had asked the girl to look after him. She had used those words exactly. Asked the girl, not requested, not suggested. Asked. The way you ask someone for a genuine favor that matters. She wrote that Nora had said yes without hesitation, which did not surprise her because she had known the girl her whole life and knew her to be someone who meant what she said and said only what she meant. Then she had written something else. She had written, I am not arranging anything. I am only removing one obstacle. The rest is his to decide or not decide. I know him. He will need considerable time. I hope he has it. Elliot sat in the chair by the window of Adeline's room and held the journal in both hands and did not move for a long time. The Colorado evening came down outside the window. The mountains went dark against the first stars. The room settled around him into the particular quiet of a place that has been holding something in trust and has now delivered it. I know him. He will need considerable time. She had known him for 30 years. She had known him better than anyone alive, had known him better perhaps than he knew himself. And she had looked at the situation that was going to exist after she was gone. The situation of a man who would seal off rooms and keep faded curtains and call grief by the name of routine. And she had taken one practical step to address it. She had sent him Nora, not as a replacement. He understood that completely and without difficulty, because he had known Adeline too, and he knew that replacement was not a concept that existed in how she thought about people. She had sent him Nora the way you send someone a rope when they are in deep water. Not because you think the rope will fix everything, because you want them to have the option of reaching for it. He had spent 3 years not reaching. He set the journal carefully on the table where he had found it. He stood up. He stood in the middle of Adeline's room in the last light of an October evening and understood with the full weight of 55 years of learning things, the slow way that he had been given something that most men were not given a second chance, that had been arranged by the person he had loved first. He was not going to waste it. Not out of piety, not out of guilt, not out of any debt to Adeline's memory. Because he was 55 years old and he understood now, holding it in his hands, what it cost to let good things pass while you were busy being careful. The following Tuesday came. He rose at his usual hour, made his coffee, put on his coat against the October chill that had settled in overnight, the first real cold of the season, the kind that reminds you that Colorado does not negotiate about winter. He sat on the porch. He waited. The field between the two properties lay quiet and silver in the early light. The dew had frozen overnight into a thin frost that covered the grass in a pale coating that caught the morning light and held it. It was the kind of morning that made the world look freshly made. He watched the field. He watched the Bennett farmhouse. No movement. He drank his coffee. He watched the mountains come up through their colors. He watched the frost begin to melt as the sun climbed. Nora did not come. He sat on that porch until the sun was high enough to take the chill out of the air, which was longer than he had sat on the porch on any Tuesday in 3 years. He sat there until the absence of her had become its own presence, a specific, particular absence with a shape he could identify and a weight he could feel. 146 Tuesdays, and then one Tuesday that wasn't. He got up from the chair. He went into the kitchen. He stood at the window over the sink and looked out at the field still and frost-silvered where it hadn't yet melted. Then he looked at the curtain. It hung in the east window where it had always hung. Pale, the color of a memory of blue. 3.5 years of Colorado sun had taken almost everything from it. What was left was something that had held on past the point where holding on made any practical difference. He reached up. He took the curtain down. He did not throw it away. He was not a man for grand gestures, and discarding it would have felt like a statement he did not intend to make. What he intended was simpler and more specific than a statement. He folded it the way you fold something that mattered, carefully with both hands, pressing the creases flat. He folded it into a square, and he opened the drawer beside the kitchen window, the drawer that held various small useful things, and he placed it inside. He closed the drawer. He stood at the window and looked out through the now bare glass at the October morning. The field, the frost, the Bennett farmhouse sitting quiet in the distance. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to find his hat. He did not go across the field that day. He went the next day, and the day after that, he spent preparing what he intended to say, which was the most difficult labor he had undertaken in 3 years, including the barn roof. The problem with preparing what to say was that he was not a man who had ever been fluent in the language of his own interior. He could tell you exactly what the north fence needed and why. He could tell you the weight and condition of his cattle at any point in the season. He could tell you the signs of a hard winter coming, in the way the aspens dropped their leaves, and the way the elk moved down from the high country earlier than usual. He could not easily tell you what was happening inside his own chest. He had tried it with Gerald, as was his custom. Gerald had listened with his usual patience and his usual absence of practical suggestions. "I need to tell her the truth," Elliot said on the second morning at the paddock rail. "The actual truth, not the truth that sounds good or the truth that makes me look better than I am. The truth that a man tells when he knows he doesn't have the time or the right to be anything less than straight." Gerald's ears moved forward. "I've been lying to myself for 3 years," Elliot said, "about what she meant by coming over here, about what I meant by being on that porch every Tuesday, about what it meant that I remembered every detail of every visit and put it all under a heading called Good Neighbor and left it there." He looked at the mountains. That's not a small thing to admit. A man who has spent 3 years telling himself one story and discovers it was a different story the whole time. He was quiet for a moment. "She deserves to know that," he said. "Not as a compliment, as an accounting. This is where I was. This is what it cost me to get here. This is what I'm asking if you'll let me ask it." Gerald breathed out slowly through his nostrils. It was not agreement exactly. It was the breath of an old horse on a cold morning, which had its own quality of patience that Elliot had always found useful. "Right," Elliot said. He went to find his hat. He put on the coat he wore when things mattered. Not his best coat. He was not a man who owned a best coat for social purposes. But the good coat, the one that was not a work coat, the one that said without saying it that this errand was not routine. He walked out the front door of the ranch house. He stood on the porch for a moment in the November morning, the air cold and clear, and carrying the particular stillness of a day that has not decided yet what it will become. And he looked across the field toward the Bennett property. Then he went down the porch steps and started walking. The field between the two properties was 40 yards of frozen ground, and October grass, and the accumulated distance of 3 years of almost. He crossed it at his natural pace, which was not hurried and was not slow, the pace of a man who has decided and is committing to the decision without drama. He could see the south fence ahead. He could see the figure at the fence, Nora working the wire, her coat the dark color she wore when she was working outdoors, her back to him as she attended to the section of fence near the property line. He kept walking. The frost crunched under his boots. She heard him before she saw him, and she turned and she looked at him coming across the field with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual because he had become, over 3 years of Tuesday mornings, quite good at reading her expressions. He came to the fence and stopped. He put his hands on the top rail. He looked at her. "Nora," he said. She looked at him. She did not fill the silence with anything. She had always known how to leave silence for the person who needed it, which was one of the things he had cataloged about her over 3 years under the heading of good neighbor, and which he now understood belonged under a different heading entirely. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said. "Which thing?" I said, she said. "You know which thing." She set down the fencing tool. He looked at the fence rail between them. The particular construction of an old boundary-worn wood-solid post, the line between one person's land and another's. That is not a wall, but is also not nothing. 10 years wouldn't be enough, he said. I've been thinking about what that meant, and what I meant when I said the thing I said before it, which was not as I let it appear to be nothing. It was something. I was calling it nothing because calling it nothing was easier and cost me less, and I am 55 years old and have gotten quite good at the economics of not saying things. She watched him. "I don't know what you meant," he said. "I want to. I'd like to know if you're willing to tell me. And I want to tell you something first before you do because it seems like the honest order." The Colorado morning held them both on either side of that fence line. "I've been on that porch every Tuesday morning for 3 years," he said. "Not by accident, not because I happen to be a man who takes his coffee on the porch at that particular hour. I was there because I knew you were coming. I knew it, and I told myself I didn't know it, and I stood there every week and waited for you to come across that field, and I put everything about it under a heading I called good neighbor, and I left it there." He looked at her directly. "I was lying to myself for 3 years. I want you to know that, not as a compliment, as an accounting." The fence line was very quiet. Somewhere above them, unseen, a hawk was making wide circles in the cold blue air. "I also want you to know," he said, "that I found Adeline's journal." Something shifted in Nora's face. "I know what she asked you," he said. "I know you've been keeping that for 3 years. I know you carried that across the field every Tuesday and set it down and picked it back up and never asked for anything for it." He stopped. He took a breath of cold Colorado air. "I have no way to repay that. I'm not going to try. I just wanted you to know that I know, and that I understand now what she was doing." He paused. "She always was smarter than me." Nora said very quietly, "She knew you." "She knew me," he agreed, "better than I knew myself," which was apparently not difficult. Something came into Nora's expression then, something that was not quite a smile, and was more than one the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a specific thing and has just seen it arrive. "She also knew me," Nora said. Elliot looked at her. "She knew why I said yes without hesitating," Nora said. "She knew it wasn't only because she asked." The fence between them held its position. The Rocky Mountains stood to the west, doing what they always did, which was to be entirely themselves and entirely indifferent to the small human negotiations happening at their feet, and to be in that indifference a kind of witness. Elliot Marin stood at the fence line of his own property and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was not relief exactly, and not joy exactly, but something in the territory between the two. The feeling of a door opening in a room you had decided was sealed. He had more to say. He had, in fact, the most important thing to say still ahead of him. But he had learned over 55 years of doing things the slow and thorough way that some things required their own time. He had started. That was enough for now. He had started, and she was still standing there in the field between them, that 40 yards of frozen October ground that had held the distance of 3 years of almost, was shorter than it had ever been. There are things a man says standing at a fence line in the cold of a November morning that he has never said to another living person. Not because the things were secret, not because he was ashamed of them, but because there had never been the right fence, the right morning, the right person standing on the other side of it. Someone who had earned the truth of him through 3 years of showing up without being asked and leaving without requiring anything in return. Elliot Marin had more to say. He said it. He told her about the 14 days, about Gerald and the fence staples, and the conversations that went nowhere productive but were necessary anyway. The way certain kinds of work are necessary, not because they produce something, but because they keep your hands occupied while your mind does what it needs to do. He told her about Declan Hurst coming to the barn and what Declan had said and what he had felt standing there afterward. Not anger, he was careful to be precise about this, because it hadn't been anger. It had been the specific sensation of a man who has been shown the edge of something and understood for the first time exactly how close to it he was standing. He told her about the Sunday he had opened Adeline's room. He told her about the journal. He did not tell it dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, and this was not a dramatic telling. It was the accounting he had promised her, plain, sequential, honest, about where he had been and what it had cost him to get from there to here. A man of 55 years standing at a fence line in November saying, "This is the distance I traveled. You should know the terrain." Nora listened the way she always listened, fully, without filling his pauses with her own thoughts, without the particular impatience that some people have for other people's processing time. She had always given him his full measure of silence, and he had always been grateful for it without ever saying so. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about the promise. Not just the fact of it, he knew the fact of it from the journal. She told him the texture of it, the way Adeline's hand had felt around hers, the grip of a woman who was tired, but still entirely present, still entirely herself. The way the afternoon light had come through that new blue curtain and fallen across the bed. What Adeline had said exactly, and the way she had said it, and the way Nora had understood in the moment of saying yes, that she was agreeing to something larger than the words described. "I want you to know something," Nora said, "about why I said yes. You don't have to explain. I want to." She said it with the particular quiet firmness she used when she meant something completely. "I said yes because she asked, and because I loved her, and because it was the right thing to do. That's all true." She looked at him. "But it stopped being only that a long time ago. I kept coming on Tuesdays because I wanted to come on Tuesdays. For the last 2 years at least, probably longer if I'm being honest, and I am trying to be honest, I came because it was the best part of my week." The fence rail was very cold under his hands. "The best part of your week," he said. "Don't make it into more than it is," she said with the slight dryness she had for moments when sentiment threatened to become excessive. "I'm just telling you the truth of it. You told me yours, that's mine." He looked at her. 10 years wouldn't be enough," he said, returning to it because it was the thing that had started everything, and he needed to understand it completely. "What did you mean?" She met his eyes without flinching. "I meant that 10 years younger would still be you," she said. "And you are exactly what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for younger. I wasn't looking for different. I was standing on your porch with a pie, and you smiled at me. That smile, the one that takes a long time to arrive, and you said what you said, and I understood that I had been coming across that field every Tuesday for 2 years because of that smile and everything that comes with it." She paused. 10 years wouldn't have changed any of that. It would have just been arithmetic. Elliot Marin stood at the fence line between their two properties and felt something arrive in his chest that he had not been expecting. Not the echo of something old, not the bittersweet quality of a feeling remembered from before. Something new, something that had not existed in him before this specific morning, and this specific woman saying these specific true things across this specific fence in the cold Colorado air. He did not have the words for it immediately. He was 55 years old and had learned slowly and through considerable trial that some things do not require immediate words. Some things ask only that you receive them. He received it. "I'd like to come calling on you," he said. "Properly, if you'll allow it. I'm aware of what that means and what it requires, and I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm asking you to let me ask." Nora Callum looked at this man on the other side of the fence. This man with his wintergrass hair and his 55 years, and his good coat and his hat in one hand on the fence rail, and the expression that came onto her face was not surprise. It was the expression of someone who has been watching a river for a long time and has finally seen it reach the place it was always going. Elliot Marin, she said, I have been waiting for you to get here for approximately 3 years. He absorbed this. I was thinking it through, he said. I know, she said. Come in, there's coffee. The courtship itself was conducted at the pace that suited them both, which was not hurried and not slow, but deliberate, the pace of two people who have known each other for years and are engaged not in the business of discovery, but in the business of acknowledgement. They were not learning who the other was. They were allowing themselves to say out loud what they already knew. There were suppers, Tuesday suppers now instead of Tuesday porch, visits, the shift from porch to table being its own kind of statement, and interior becoming exterior. There were Sunday afternoons riding through the Colorado landscape in the last weeks before the snow made riding purely practical rather than pleasurable, through the aspen groves already stripped bare along the creek that ran between their properties across the high meadow south of the Bennett land, where you could see the mountains in 3 directions and feel for a moment like the world was exactly the size it needed to be. There were evenings on the porch of the Marin Ranch, which had always been Elliot's porch, but felt in this particular November and December like it was becoming something more shared. Nora sat in the other chair, the chair that had been there since before Adeline's illness, and had never had a regular occupant, and they talked about the things they talked about: the cattle and the season, and the state of the south fence, and the almanac's predictions for the winter, and increasingly other things. Things that lived below the practical surface, things that came out in the particular quiet of a Colorado evening when the mountains were going dark against a sky full of cold stars, and there was nowhere either of them needed to be. He told her about his father's ranch 40 miles north where he had grown up, the hard winters of his boyhood and what they had taught him about patience, how he had come to this land at 24 with Adeline and 2 horses and a set of tools, and the belief, which turned out to be largely correct, that what land required was sustained attention over a long time rather than dramatic effort over a short one. She told him about her parents moving to Denver when her sister's children came, and the particular quality of running a property alone, not the difficulty of it, which she had managed, but the silence of the decisions. Every decision made without a second opinion. Every problem solved without the option of saying, "What do you think?" The weight of that which was not unbearable but was real. You never asked, he said on one of those evenings. Asked what? For help. With anything. In 3 years. I didn't need help, she said. You fixed the south fence in the spring flood alone, he said. I saw the repair. I'm a capable woman. I know you are, he said. I'm not saying you needed help. I'm saying you never asked for it. There's a difference. She looked at him in the way she looked at things she was considering seriously. I came here every Tuesday, she said. That was its own kind of asking. He thought about that for a moment. Yes, he said. It was. Reverend Aldous Crane came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning in December. He was a tall man, spare and straight-backed, with the particular quality of someone who has spent decades saying difficult things to people and has developed through practice the ability to say them without cruelty and without apology. Elliot respected him for this. It was not a common skill. He came into the kitchen and accepted coffee and sat at the table with the directness of a man who has something to say and intends to say it before the coffee is finished. You're 55 years old, he said. I'm aware, Elliot said. She's 25. Also aware. Reverend Crane wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at Elliot the way he looked at things he was examining honestly without flinching away from what he found. I'm not here to tell you it's wrong, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm here because I think you're a man who has earned the right to be asked directly rather than whispered about, and because I think questions asked directly deserve direct answers. He paused. So I'm asking directly. Have you thought about what this means for her in 20 years? Elliot looked at his own coffee cup. In 20 years, he said, I'll be 75 years old. He looked up at the Reverend. And in 20 years, she'll have had 20 years beside a man who says what he means and shows up when he says he'll show up and does not make her carry things alone that don't have to be carried alone. He paused. I can't give her everything a younger man could give her. I know that. I've spent considerable time being honest with myself about that. He set the cup down. But I can give her what I am, completely, without reservation. And what I am has been built over 55 years of paying attention to the things that matter And I think that's worth something. I think she thinks it's worth something too, and she's not a woman who is wrong about things. Reverend Crane was quiet for a moment. No, he said. She is not. He finished his coffee. I'll need you both at the church on Thursday afternoon, he said, to discuss the arrangements. He put on his hat and went out. Elliot sat at the kitchen table in the winter morning light and looked at the east window, bare now where the curtain had been, the light coming through it clean and unfiltered, and felt the particular quietness of a man who has come through the long part of something and can see for the first time the other side. They were married on the first Saturday of February 1884. The church in Durango, held by Elliot's count, approximately twice the number of people it was designed for comfortably, which told him something about the extent to which his and Nora's situation had been a topic of community interest. Durango had been watching this particular development with the close attention it gave to anything that confirmed its sense of itself as a place where human lives were interesting, and it had turned out in force to see the resolution. He stood at the front of that church in his good jacket, the jacket Adeline had bought him 12 years ago for her sister's wedding, in which still fit because he had never significantly changed, and he watched Nora Callum come through the door. She wore a dress the color of Colorado pine trees in December. Deep green, almost dark the green of things that stay alive through winter. It was not a conventional color for a wedding dress, and she wore it with the complete composure of a woman who had made a considered choice and was not interested in defending it. She was 25 years old, and she walked toward him with the same unhurried, purposeful quality with which she crossed the field on Tuesday mornings. No performance of it, just the real thing, which was better. He watched her come. He was aware in the particular way that moments of significance make you aware of everything around him, the cold light through the church windows, the sound of the congregation settling, the smell of candle wax and pine, and he was aware of all of it, the way you are aware of the frame of a painting while looking at the painting itself. Background, context, the thing that held the thing that mattered. She reached him. She looked at him with the expression he had been cataloging for 3 years under wrong headings and now knew how to read correctly. He thought about a Tuesday morning in September. A pie on a porch railing. 10 years wouldn't be enough. He understood now, with 55 years of having learned things, the slow way that she had been telling him the truth with complete precision. It was not that 10 years would have been insufficient. It was that the years were not the point at all. The point was the man who had spent 55 of them becoming exactly who he was. That man. No other. He had almost talked himself out of being that man. He did not think about the arithmetic anymore. Reverend Crane performed the ceremony with the economy of a man who understands that the words that matter most are the simple ones, and the church was warm with the presence of people who had come, whatever their opinions about the arrangement, because there is something in a community that responds to two people standing up and saying plainly, this is the true thing. Afterward, Cornelia Voss cried in the front row, which surprised him slightly because Cornelia was not a woman who displayed strong emotion publicly. She caught his eye and straightened immediately and resumed her usual expression, which was the expression of a woman conducting a cost-benefit analysis. He nodded to her. She nodded back. Harriet Lowe, Nora's friend, had been the one who cried without apology, which was more in keeping with what he knew of her character. From Denver, Declan Hurst had sent a card. It was brief and genuine. He wished them well and said so without apparent bitterness, which was the action of a man with more character than circumstances had required him to demonstrate, and Elliot filed it under things he thought well of without needing to say out loud. Nora moved into the Marin Ranch in February on a day when the last snow was coming off the mountain peaks in long white scarves, and the first suggestion of something green was showing in the lower meadows. Not spring yet, but the promise of it, which is its own kind of hope. She brought her books. She brought her mother's recipe collection written in a cramped hand on cards that had seen considerable use. She brought the specific practical competence that she brought to everything, which meant that within a week the ranch's accounts were in better order than they had been in 3 years, and within a month the efficiency of certain operations that Elliot had been running on habit and instinct had been improved in ways he would not have thought to improve them. He watched her settle into the house the way water settles into level ground, not forcing, not asserting, simply finding the natural place for each thing and occupying it completely. She did not change everything. She was not a woman who changed things for the sake of change. The almanac stayed where he kept the almanacs. The tools were where they had always been. The particulars of the ranch's daily rhythm remained largely what they had been because those particulars were not wrong, they had simply been lonely. What changed was that they were not lonely anymore. One evening in March, she found him in the kitchen after supper and said, "The room." He knew which room. "I think we should sort through it together," she said. "When you're ready, not urgently, just together." He looked at her. "Next Saturday," he said. They went through Adeline's room on a Saturday morning in March when the light was coming through the window at a low angle and the mountains were doing the thing they did on clear winter mornings, standing absolutely still and enormous and present as if they had been waiting all night for the chance to be looked at. They were careful with it, deliberate, not mournful. This was not grief's work, which had already been done in the slow years since 1880. This was something else. The work of acknowledging that a person had been here and had mattered and would continue to matter in the way that people continue to matter after they are gone, in the quality of what they built, and in the choices they made, and in the people they trusted. Elliot found the journal on the side table where he had replaced it that Sunday evening in October. He picked it up. He held it for a moment. Then he opened the drawer of the side table and placed it there, not hidden, not displayed. Kept. The way you keep things that belong to the permanent record of a life. "She would have liked you," he said. Not to console Nora, not as sentiment, as a statement of fact. "I know," Nora said. "She did like me, she just didn't get enough time to show it properly." He looked at her. "She showed it," he said. "She showed it on a Tuesday." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, she did." They opened the window to let in the March air, which was cold and clean and carried the particular smell of Colorado and late winter pine and snowmelt, and the distant mineral smell of the mountains, and they worked together through the morning with the quiet efficiency of two people who have learned that shared labor is its own form of conversation, saying things to each other without words that words would have made smaller. William Marin arrived in January of 1885 on a morning so cold that the thermometer outside the kitchen window had given up pretending and simply refused to register anything meaningful. He came into the world with his mother's red hair, a specific and vivid red, the color of the aspen leaves in their last week before they fell, and his father's quality of looking at things. That deliberate, unhurried look. The look of someone who is paying close attention and intends to make sense of what they find. He was from the first hour a person worth watching. Elliot held him in the kitchen while the doctor and the neighbor woman who had come to help were in the other room, and the wood stove was going, and the cold was pressing at the windows from outside. And he stood in his own kitchen at 57 years old, holding a person who was an hour old and understood something he had not understood before. This was not complicated. This was not the product of philosophy or calculation. It was the simple physical understanding that arrives through the hands, through the specific weight of a specific child in your arms on a specific January morning, that some things are beyond the reach of arithmetic entirely. He had worried about this. He was an honest man, and he had worried about it honestly. He had said it to Nora in the careful way he said things that concerned him. "Will I be enough?" She had looked at him with the expression she had for questions that did not require long answers. "You came across the field with lumber the morning after the spring flood," she said. "Before I'd asked, before I'd even assessed the damage properly. You were there." She met his eyes. "That's what a father does. You already know how to do it. You've been doing it for 3 years. He had not brought it up again. He stood now in his kitchen holding his son, and the cold pressed at the glass, and the wood stove held it back, and the mountains stood to the west in the dark January morning, enormous and indifferent and permanent. And he did not think about being 75 when this boy was 20. He thought about this morning, this hour, this weight in his hands. This was the hour. This was the weight. He did not intend to spend it anywhere else. The months that followed had the quality of something being built. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. The way a good building goes up one course of material at a time, each one placed carefully and allowed to set before the next one goes on. The way things are built when the builder intends them to last. Spring came to the Marin Ranch in the way spring always came, slowly. Grudgingly, the mountains holding their snow long after the lower meadows had gone green, as if they were not yet certain the season had earned their confidence. The creek between the two properties ran high with snowmelt. The cattle were moved to the north pasture in April. The garden along the south wall of the ranch house was put in by both of them, with William in the basket Nora had rigged in the shade of the porch, and the division of the work was decided entirely by who knew more about what, which sometimes meant Nora directing the spacing of the rows and sometimes meant Elliot doing the heavier digging, and sometimes meant both of them on their knees in the same patch of ground working toward the same thing from different angles. Durango continued to have opinions, as Durango always did. The opinions had shifted as opinions in small communities shift when the thing they were about has resolved itself in a way that is hard to argue with. There was still the occasional comment about the age difference, the occasional raised eyebrow from someone new to the county who had not been present for the preceding years. But the people who had been there, who had watched Elliot Marin carry his grief through 3 winters without complaint, and had watched Nora Callum run 40 acres alone without asking for help. She didn't need those people had arrived by and large at the position that what had happened between these two was not surprising and was in the specific way of things that are both unexpected and correct. Exactly right. Cornelia Voss told Harriet Lowe, and Harriet Lowe told Nora, and Nora told Elliot, with the slight dryness she had for such things. Cornelia has decided you're an example. Of what? Elliot said. Of not letting the arithmetic stop you from asking the question. He thought about that. I nearly did, he said. I know, she said. That's why she finds it instructive. William learned to walk in October of 1885. He did it with the deliberateness that had characterized him from the beginning. Considered methodical, the walk of a person who has decided to do something and is doing it correctly rather than quickly. He took his time. He fell several times and looked at the floor with the expression of someone making a note about the floor for future reference and got back up. Elliot watched this from the doorway between the kitchen and the sitting room on an evening when the fire was going and the October wind was at the windows and the ranch was doing what it did in autumn evenings, settling into itself, becoming quiet, becoming the best version of what it was. He had not expected this. He meant that specifically and completely. He had not expected to be standing in this doorway watching a red-haired boy with his eyes take deliberate steps across a floor. He was still learning with Nora on her knees at the far end saying, come on, in the tone she used for things she believed in completely. He had not expected to be here. He had at 55 years old arrived at the private and unexamined position that certain things were behind him. Not consciously, not as a decision. The way things settle into position below the level of deliberate thought, becoming assumptions you don't know you're making until something comes along and shows you the assumption was wrong. He had been wrong. He stood in the doorway of his own house and watched his son walk toward his wife and understood that being wrong in this particular direction, underestimating what remained, miscounting what was still possible, was the most significant error he had almost permanently committed. He had almost let the arithmetic stop him. He thought about that sometimes. The version of himself that had been sitting on the porch 3 years ago, numbering his years and finding them excessive, measuring the distance between 55 and 25, and concluding that the distance was disqualifying. That man had been being careful. That man had been being responsible. That man had been being, as Adeline would have said, with the particular patience she had for his particular variety of stubbornness, wrong. Wrong not about the numbers. The numbers were real. The numbers had real weight and real consequence, and anyone who said otherwise was not paying attention. Wrong about what the numbers meant. Wrong about whether 55 years of becoming a specific kind of man, a man who showed up with lumber without being asked who said what he meant, who sat with the things that were hard rather than walking away from them, was too much or too little or the wrong kind of thing. It was not the wrong kind of thing. It turned out exactly the right kind of thing. On a September morning in 1886, Elliot was at the North Fence. 3 years since the pie. 3 years since the Tuesday morning that had begun the slow rearrangement of everything. The mountains to the west were doing what they did in September, catching the early light and turning it into the color that has no proper name, that exists between gold and orange, and then is gone. He was checking the wire on the third post when he heard the gate on the south end of the property. He looked up. Nora was crossing the field. Not from the Bennett property, that land was leased now to a young family from the east, who were learning what Colorado required of the people who farmed it, and they were learning it in the way everything worthwhile is learned, which is slowly and by doing, and with occasional expensive mistakes. She was crossing from the ranch house, coming across the home field, the field that had been his field alone for a long time, and was now entirely, completely, in every sense that a place can be shared theirs. She was carrying William on her hip. He was 20 months old, red-haired and solid, and looking at the world with the expression he always wore, which was the expression of someone conducting a systematic inventory of everything he encountered and intending to understand it fully. He was looking at the mountains the way his father had looked at the mountains for 31 years, with the complete attention of someone who finds them genuinely inexhaustible. Elliot set down the fencing tool and walked to the gate and opened it. She came through and he took the boy from her arms. William went to him with the easy confidence of a child who has always been received, and he held his son against his shoulder, and his son looked at the mountains and then looked at him with those Callum eyes, sharp and direct and entirely unafraid. He looked at Nora. She was looking at him with the expression he had spent 3 years misreading and now knew entirely. The expression of a woman who is exactly where she intended to be. The Colorado morning held them, the three of them, in the north field of the Marin Ranch, with the mountains to the west going gold and the September grass silver with dew, and Gerald in the far paddock paying no attention whatsoever, which was Gerald's prerogative. Elliot looked at his wife and his son, and the mountains, and the land, and the morning. "If only I were 10 years younger," he said. He said it the way he said things now, plainly, without deflection, with the full knowledge of what the words meant and what they were inviting. Nora looked at him the way she had looked at him on the porch 3 years ago, with the pie on the railing between them. The look that had started everything. 10 years wouldn't have been enough," she said. "I needed exactly you, exactly this." William turned his head and looked between them with the serene incomprehension of a child who does not yet understand what is being said, but understands in the way that children understand things before they have words for them, that whatever it is good, it is safe, it is the temperature of home. Elliot held his son and looked at his wife and understood with the full weight of 57 years and the specific clarity that only comes from having nearly chosen differently that some things cannot be measured in years at all. Not the things that matter most. Not the things that arrive quietly on a Tuesday morning across 40 yards of Colorado field, carried by a woman who shows up without being asked and means what she says and knows without requiring you to explain yourself exactly what kind of man you are. He had spent 3 years calling it good neighbor. He had spent 3 years being careful with the arithmetic. He had nearly let the number on the calendar convince him that what he had to offer was not enough, that a man of 55 had too many years behind him and too few ahead to be worth the asking. He had been wrong about that. He had been precisely, specifically, importantly wrong. What he had to offer was 55 years of becoming, 55 years of learning what mattered and what didn't, 55 years of working land that asked for sustained attention over a long time rather than dramatic effort over a short one, and learning to apply that same patience to everything, to grief, to work, to the people he loved. That was not nothing. That was not too much of one thing and not enough of another. That was a man. Exactly this man. The one who had stood on the porch that September morning and said a foolish thing and been told gently and precisely and without any ambiguity whatsoever that the foolish thing was wrong, that the years were not the point, that the point was who the years had made him, and that who the years had made him was exactly enough. He had walked across a field in November to say so. It was the most important walk he had ever taken. He had taken it because a woman with cold hands and a well-made pie had looked at him one morning across a porch railing and refused to let the arithmetic be the last word. He closed the gate behind them. He walked across the field with his family in the September morning, the mountains gold to the west, the grass silver beneath their feet. William looking at everything with the deliberate attention of a person who intends to understand the world and has, without knowing it, yet been given the best possible ground to understand it from. The morning held them. Colorado held them. And Elliot Marin, 57 years old, walked home through the light and was grateful past all calculation, past all the arithmetic of age and years and distance, that he had made the pie worth saying something foolish about, that he had stood on the porch, that he had let the smile come, that he had crossed the field. Some doors do not announce themselves as doors. They look like fence lines, like Tuesday mornings, like a woman coming across a frosted field with something warm in her hands. You do not know they are doors until you have the courage to walk through them. He had walked through, and everything on the other side of it was exactly enough.